Mary Jen McGowan. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I'm very grateful to be here. I'm excited to be here. It's been a lot of fun so far to learn what everyone's doing in heterodoxy. And Brent and I were talking last night, and it's now a verb to heterodox somebody. To heterodox somebody. So we have, this panel is on teaching with heterodox values. And so we have 3 panelists here. So I'm going to ask them some really hard questions. And just kidding. And we're going to have a lot of a discussion about teaching because as John so eloquently just told us, we've got a garden to plant and to tend. So starting us off on your right, Stephen David. Stephen David is the professor of international relations. His work focuses on security studies, and American foreign policy, Sino-American relations, and turmoil in the Middle East. David's teaching covers a wide range of subjects with security issues at its core. For undergraduates, he teaches courses that cover an introduction to the field, the impact of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and political violence. For graduate students, David teaches on the causes of peace, internal war, and nuclear politics. David's scholarship emphasizes the impact of internal politics on foreign policy, particularly among developing countries. David has also focused on the causes and consequences of internal war, as discussed in his book, Catastrophic Consequences, which argued that inadvertent harm caused by states torn apart by internal conflict is a greater threat to global stability and American interests than deliberate decisions of leaders to make war. Whew. Okay. Rellie, right? Rellie Derfler-Rozin. Oh my gosh, I knew I was going to mess it up. Rellie Derfler-Rozin is a professor of management and organization at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and the academic director of the Master of Management Studies and online Master in Management Studies programs. She studies how social context impacts employees' decision-making. She examines situations in which people in organizational settings behave in ways that end up counter to their own goal because of innate social needs, such as the need to belong or the need for social status. Rellie teaches a course titled Challenge Your Thinking, Challenge the Conversation, which uses the latest pedagogical techniques and relevant literature to help students develop skills such as thinking like a scientist, negotiating conflict, and giving and receiving constructive feedback. Brent Goldfarb is the Dean's Professor of Entrepreneurship and Academic Director of the Dingman Center at the University of Maryland. He works at the intersection of empirical methods and the philosophy of science to develop solutions to the reliability crisis in science. In recent years, Brent has developed a real entrepreneurship course structure where students run real businesses, and is a co-founder of a deep tech startup. Goldfarb was also associated with the Entrepreneurship Research Lab in the University of Wisconsin. Professor Goldfarb's research bridges the areas of entrepreneurship, economics, strategy, management, and finance. So welcome to our guests. Very cool. It's such a great thing to have people from so many different disciplines interested in such a great topic. So I have some questions. So I think what we'll do is I'll ask the question and then give you each time to answer that question to start at least. So each of you has taken a different approach to bringing heterodox values into the classroom. Can you briefly describe how your teaching reflects those values and why this approach matters today? So Stephen, can we start with you?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think the course most relevant to this conference is I teach a course called Does Israel Have a Future, which examines existential threats to Israel, both internally and externally. I've been teaching the course for about 10 years, and it was especially poignant, relevant after October 2nd. And the class includes students who had relatives living in Gaza, students who have relatives fighting in the Israeli Defense Forces, some people from China who wander in and say, what the heck did I get myself into? And others. And this class taking place at a time of university protest and a lot of anger and emotion was especially, I think, compelling during these fraught times. What I did in this class is first lay out my own sense of how I want to run the class, that I want people to feel free to argue, to dispute with one another, as long as they do so in a civil way. I laid my own cards out on the table. I said, I'm Jewish. I believe in Israel's right to exist. You don't have to accept that premise. I can't promise that I'll be totally objective, but what I can promise is that your views won't be held against you. No right or wrong views. There are good and bad views. I made sure to include readings across the ideological spectrum, including readings from the Israeli right, readings that supported Hamas, and stuff in between. We also began each class with a debate where students debated very controversial positions. Does Israel have the right to exist as a Jewish state? You support the BDS movement? Was Hamas justified in launching its attack on October 7th? And before the students did the debate, I had each student choose a side, telling them to pick a side they felt comfortable with, and then I flipped them. And they all had to argue the opposite side. So you have students wearing kippah, yarmulke, explaining why BDS is a good thing, and students dressed with a hijab and such, explaining why Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And for the most part, I think it worked.
That's great. It sounds like a very challenging class. And do you think that like the personal stories that people told helped that dynamic, to help create a constructive dialogue?
Yes. And especially at October 7th, the personal stories got very emotional. I mean, there's a fair amount of crying in the class, and that was difficult to deal with. But it was also, well, for me, the class, I think, more compelling. But again, when you know people who've been killed, when you know people who are engaged in battle, who are victims of battle, it personalizes the class and makes it much less of an abstract entity. And that was important. And again, this was all taking place with an encampment and screaming protests and all kinds of hostility and emotion on all sides of the issue.
Great. And sorry, we'll get back to the question in a second. But so did your university administration, they weren't worried about your class?
I don't know if they weren't worried about. I think they welcomed a class that included diverse viewpoints, and especially, I mean, what I'd like to think is you could read my syllabus and have no idea where I stood on these issues. And sadly, I don't think that's the case throughout academia writ large. I mean, too often, certainly in the Middle East, balance would be you have a Palestinian panelist who seeks the destruction of Israel, balanced by a Jewish panelist who seeks the destruction of Israel. And having, I think, striving for true balance, including presenting views that you strongly disagree with, is too low in academia. And I would hope with organizations such as the Heterodox Academy, that can change, especially with an issue as emotional as this. Look, I also teach a class on China and the Sino-American confrontation. And I mean, there are no emotions, I shouldn't tell you no emotions, but it's much less fraught than teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I should also say I had 2 interventions by OIE, which is, I don't know if you have that here, the Organization of Institutional Equity. I think there were some anonymous complaints made about the class, I think by visitors who were complaining that one side or the other side was saying things that should not have been said. But again, this was an anonymous complaint, the content of which was also unknown, so it's very hard to respond to. And someone said someone who I don't know said something, and I don't know what they said, but I was asked, I had to respond to that. Did it look? And I'm thinking to myself, there are some professors, and sometimes, who needs this? Talk about China, and no one ever said, hey, this guy, is too easy on Taiwan, or doesn't care about Xi Jinping. So with the Middle East, you borrow yourself through trouble sometimes. And I just hope it doesn't discourage, especially younger professors, from getting involved in controversial issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ellie, do you want me to read the question again?
Alice? Vilka vilket happened to Can you hear me? Yeah. So first, thank you, Stephen, for also teaching this class. So first, I have been teaching negotiation. I've been teaching for the last 14 years since I arrived here. And I always believe that negotiation and include dispute resolution as well is always about actually trying to break zero-sum mindset, trying to enlarge the pie. And all of those principles are actually aligned as well. I've been teaching business ethics, and this is how I came to know actually Jonathan Haidt, and always from the beginning would talk about moral foundation theory, show them his famous TED Talk, so this was already incorporated in my classes. I guess the class where it's being used the most is this Challenger Conversation class that you have mentioned. It was thanks to Rajri, who kind of pulled me to this class after October 7th, and you cannot say no to Rajri. That's the first thing. But also it was actually a good, I actually agreed also because to co-teach this class, we are co-teaching, we are both instructors. And this class is about engaging in a respectful, fact-based dialogue, similar, Stephen, to what you described. We have different lessons, different debates on the controversial issues in the U.S., and we make students prepare for both sides of the debate in advance. They don't know which side they will be randomly assigned to on the day of the debate, and then they have to, then they're being told which side, and then they have to have the debate. And we've had debates over issues like affirmative action in universities, transgender in sports, all like the controversial issues there. We try to give, so the beginning of the class is about more challenge your own thinking, and then the other, after a few classes, it's more about challenge the conversation itself. So it's all about challenging assumptions like we have in the scientific method. So we focus on the scientific method, about challenging assumptions. And again, we give them the background of moral foundation theory. We added stuff on oppression Olympics, the age of grievance, if you know, Frank Bournier from Duke, which elicits a very emotionally heavy discussion in classroom both, and I teach it at the undergraduate level, but we have a shortened version for the executive MBAs, and it's not easy to talk about this issue. So again, it's a very emotionally heavy to teach this class, but I also always feel very fortunate and it's very meaningful. Like Stephen, to say, and I probably also identify from my accent, I'm Israeli, Israeli American. It's been one of my motivation to join this class has been October 7th, because a part of the grieving over what happened there, seeing those violent protests, seeing that there are signs like rape is resistance and all those like horrific things, really created a crisis for me to be in academia here. So this was a good way for me to engage with this in like we should engage with this. and maybe differently. So then I'll give you a different perspective from you, Stephen, and we maybe disagree, which is good. We should disagree or everything, right? So I actually added on top of all those heterodox values, which of course are ascribed to, I also fundamentally believe that we do have the moral responsibility to not elevate extremes on either side and try to actually promote a conversation that will lead to some kind of a future-looking solution, especially when it is about very things like, people's lives and so forth. So when I do, and we did do in the class one session on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're going to have another one in a few weeks, and the one in a few weeks actually managed to find a Palestinian and an Israeli panelist, but I was very intentional about choosing both in a way that and I tell the students, as much as I will never bring a right-wing extremist, there's no problem with the right, but extremist, who is saying we should kill her or we should throw all the house from here. I would also not bring a vehemently anti-Zionist to say Israel should not exist. I don't think it helps. I actually want to bring both people that have different maybe perspectives. They may disagree on some issues, but they do share the common value of we should have dignity for both people, for both Israelis and Palestinians. So I kind of always think about myself as navigating this tension of, yes, there is nuance, and that, yes, we should think about complexities and think as complex and share views, but it's also okay to say that some things are actually fundamentally wrong. Right? So I told the students I wear this pin because of the hostages, because initiation of violence, terror is never the way, period. And it's okay to say that this is wrong. And again, this is my belief here.
Thank you. I think you're both really lucky. I know at Charlotte, I think we really avoided the whole issue. We had some protests, but there weren't classes, there weren't discussion groups. It was just like, let's just keep it as quiet as possible and move on. And so it's good to be able to talk about it. Yeah. So Brent?
Yeah, it seems like Charlotte sends how my family operates. So first of all, thank you for this question, and thank you for putting me last. And the reason is that I don't actually teach controversial subjects, but at the same time, I do teach this skill set of going out and finding diverse opinions. Because when you teach entrepreneurship, it is a pragmatic skill. I actually, as Mary Jo mentioned, I have my students go out and start businesses, and in so doing, they need to go out and find customers. But they always come in with an idea about what they're going to do, which is inevitably narrow and wrong because they're trying to solve a problem they perceive. And entrepreneurship is about finding a solution general enough that many people will buy it. And that requires a lot of shifting of their prior thoughts and thinking about things. And so there's the whole toolkit in entrepreneurship. It's called customer discovery, where you're literally supposed to go out and listen to people. What's easy about it is it's not a morally complex and charged issue, usually, unless the entrepreneur is particularly passionate about their idea. And these are programs, they're funded. This has been embodied in a program called I-Core, which I don't know why it's called I-Core, so we'll leave that aside. But where inventors go out and they're supposed to conduct 100 different interviews to learn about why their product or why their idea is useful. And so it occurred to me in thinking about this, that when we talk about tough conversations or heterodox values, no one really care about it if the thing we're talking about is morally charged. Otherwise, I think the skill is kind of present in many of us, and it's that extra, this is my hypothesis, it's this extra lowering of more meaning on the topic that creates the topic. And I just wonder if that tells us something about our challenge or in certain way.
I might disagree with you a little bit.
Well, but please don't.
So I teach public policy, and I students do. They don't have to create a business, but they have to create a policy that they want to see, like the North Carolina legislature pass or the U.S. Congress pass. And so they're kind of policy entrepreneurs, and they have to think of these different topics. And for a long time, everybody wanted to legalize marijuana in North Carolina. I was like, okay, no more of that topic. But it got super heated. I mean, people got very uptight about it because people had very different views on it. So it's not, I don't think it's always just the emotional or moral content of it. I think sometimes it's like.
But isn't the legalization of marijuana, that sounds like really a morally charged issue?
Yeah, I mean,
We're talking about like whether like food delivery.
It's just like much more mundane and pragmatic because whatever I'm talking about is something you could build in 14 weeks because it's in a semester.
Yeah. Well, and I always challenge them, okay, well, what are the costs and benefits here? Like when they get down to the nitty gritty of it, then that's when it gets less emotionally charged. When you're talking about, okay, what are the costs? What are the benefits to the state? What's the tax revenue bill look like? Then they start thinking, oh, okay, well, and that's just going to make us do all that analysis. I just wanted to, be able to smoke pot. So, it's when you get down to the details of it, sometimes that can actually lower the temperature, I think. So, yeah. We can sort of agree to disagree, right?
I can have what, Dolly?
Okay, so our next question is, what does it mean to teach with heterodox values? How is that different from simply encouraging classroom debate? So, anybody want to jump in, or you want to start down there, Stephen?
People can jump in if they're on.
What are heterodox values to you?
So one thing, so me and my co-instructor, Professor Patiti, we did last year purely SLAD training at the George Mercatus Center, Jackie as well, actually, which was very enlightening. It was a whole day, very, very tiring, doing all those controversial issues, but it was very helpful. And I now actually use this method also, not necessarily every time in the class because it requires smaller groups, but kind of the principles of these, which are very much aligned with HXA, right? So in the introduction for our class, we talk about this CARE framework. So it's curiosity, authenticity, respect for everyone. Everyone has a place on the table. It's part of like the contract that we have in the classroom. And it's something that we all should agree upon. We spend some time talking about psychological safety versus safetyism. And, what's going, so we actually brought a guest speaker to talk about this as well. So we try to prepare them for those conversations. I'm trying to think more and try to use those tools. So what we learned, for example, in this pluralist lab session is, so I can ask, and I did it actually last Friday when I was teaching executive MBAs, I asked, so we let them hear Frank Bruni, and we asked them, does it resonate with you, the notion of the Prussian Olympiads, the age of grievance? And when I asked my classroom, what do you think? I asked someone, just say, what do you think? Does it resonate or not? Don't explain yet. And when this person said, actually said that this does not resonate with me at all, I said, okay. And then I went to another student and said, why do you think that John, I don't remember his name, I know who was, actually said that it does not resonate with him? And then she will try to explain why he thinks this is the case, and then he will say whether she got it right or not, and we started having this conversation there. And again, it has to be built, though, on those principles that we have respect to each other, and that we, like John said before, that it's not acceptable to say, oh, because he's an idiot. Right? This is not a response. We really have to explain like what in there, and we bring our personal experience, and then we have to be authentic with this as well. I'm trying to think what else. What I used last year, I'll say it, which I think is also important. As much as we can tell students, please disagree with us, sometimes they will refuse to do this because we're the professors. So one tool that I use, for example, is to open an anonymous survey after class and just ask them, give some feedback about this controversial class. So it's anonymous. And as much as I would have preferred that it will not be anonymous, they would feel like to say, it is another tool in the toolkit to kind of, and then I can address those. I can read on this anonymous survey what people have said, and I can address it in class. Yeah, okay. Stephen?
I would just add, we hear there are surveys that show very high percentages of undergraduate students say they don't speak their mind because they're fearful of what either the professor or their fellow students will think. And it's our job as professors to fight that kind of impression, to let students speak out, even if they're advancing a view that they feel that their professor or fellow students don't agree with. The notion that students are sort of sitting there wanting to say something but are fearful of expressing an opinion, it should not be what universities are about. And insofar as we can cultivate an atmosphere where that doesn't happen, that has to be a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Brent?
So I wanna back up for a second. I don't have a great answer to your question, but I'm gonna answer slightly a different one, perhaps. One of the things that strikes me about this problem and thinking about morality is like the technology of argument. In a way, what I'm in is in that it's Shabbat. So in the Jewish tradition, we have this idea of arguments for the sake of heaven. And there's a story between two houses, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, and they're arguing. And the story goes that as they were arguing, Hillel always put Shammai's argument first, right? And it was always given the reverence. And then God decided whose argument was correct. And he was like, well, they're both true, but Hillel's is more true. And the reason is because Hillel was reviewing the idea of disagreement. And it became an argument for the sake of heaven as opposed to an argument for the sake of truth. They weren't trying to be right. They were arguing for the sake of argument. And what that does is, and so I'm trying to take this to heart because I had very strong emotional ideas about what's right and wrong in certain circumstances, and people disagree with me. And so when you flip it to this idea of arguing for the sake of heaven, your goal is not to win, but it is to understand. And that's a different goal. And when we get to that space, it diffuses the emotional charge in a particular way. And so when you're doing customer discovery, this doesn't matter because you're just not emotionally charged. But when you move into these areas where people get excited and people think that winning is a moral, is a moral imperative in a way, when you change it to an argument for the sake of heaven, that disappears. Because what you're trying to do is revere the process as opposed to the outcome. And I wonder if that's something to elevate.
Yeah, awesome. Because it just made me also think about something else we're doing. So I've also adopted a platform I've been using in my negotiation classes that is called iDecision Games, in which people are assigned to it's business negotiation. They have a negotiation, then they put the outcomes, and they can immediately rate each other on the platform. And in the end of the class, they get a reputation index of what other people thought about them throughout the negotiation exercises. So in the Challenger Conversation class, for example, so we do, they read some of the Think Again book by Adam Grant and read about the prosecutor mindset, the preacher mindset, the scientific mindset, and so forth. So when we do sometimes we just do role plays of just in dyad instead of a class discussion of the day. And so they have
an argument about something or like a discussion about something, and then in the end they actually rate each other on to what extent you felt that the other person was actually in a prosecutor mindset or in a preacher mindset, to what extent they did different stuff, and then we actually ask them to what extent you would like to talk with this person again to have more, and then we actually I go back and I look at the data and then I show them, and usually it holds. Then when people were more in the scientific mindset, less preachers, then people are also significantly more likely to want to talk to them again, and so forth. So also using those tools of actually showing that it actually has the effect on the interaction with others is another tool that we've been using.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, getting people to understand that it really has an effect is really important. And I want to go back to something that Stephen said about students being scared in the classroom. I mean, I'm sure most of you have had students that will say, oh, I didn't say anything in class because I was afraid. But here's what I really think. And sometimes I'll have students come up to me after class and they'll say that. And I'll say, well, why didn't you say that in class? You know, we're like a free speech place here. This is a safe space. And was it, oh, you know, my peers. So one of my colleagues and I had started a project, we haven't got very far, on what tools help students reduce that fear. And one of our other colleagues teaches a class called North Carolina Student Legislature, which is a debate class to try and get bills before the state legislature. And he has them line up at the beginning of class, beginning of the semester, all the Democrats on that side, all the Republicans on that side. And students felt in that class that they were safer because they already knew where everybody stood. And so they didn't have to it wasn't like hidden information. It was out in the open. And so they knew if they were talking to somebody on the other side that they were actually talking to a Democrat, or if they were, vice versa. So it ended up fostering more debate than previously. Like they felt safer, which I was like, that's pretty cool. Just having that information out in the open. Now, I'm not all that comfortable asking students their political affiliations, a political scientist, but I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so when we go back, let's get back to the questions. I've tried different things in my classroom, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges for faculty. It's like you've got your set syllabus, you know what you're teaching. How do you start something like this? Like, how do you start implementing heterodox values? How do you start using a new tool? How do you get that whole process started in your classroom? Is it gradual, or do you just throw out the syllabus and start over? What kind of advice would you give, or where would you start?
Can I just say something about what you just said, or it's being afraid? We're talking. One of the first things I've encountered in my many decades of teaching is international students are now coming to me and say they're afraid to speak their mind because they're worried about losing their visa status, that someone will turn them in, and the students will say to me, can I feel safe in this class saying, attacking the Trump administration or doing something of that nature? And when they ask me that, I tell them I can't guarantee their safety. And that feels awful as a professor. Yeah. But I can't sit there and say no one in this class is not going to turn you in. And it's sad to me that we reached a stage in American life where this kind of thing has to be a concern. But it's a real one.
That's scary. I mean, and scary as a professor, too, because you don't want your students taken away. And I always like this one about the intellectually humble. Teaching students to be humble, I think, is a great starting point, because some students come in and they think they know it all. I mean, they just do. And teaching them that they may not always be right, and that humility can help them understand that we don't want somebody kicked out of the country because of their political beliefs.
I got to say, I know this is a bit off the topic, but again, I teach American foreign policy, American politics, and all this stuff. And I try not to create a partisan atmosphere in class. I recognize there are students in my class who support Trump, who support this administration. At the same time, when there are assaults on what I consider to be the foundations of democracy, it's hard to be quiet about it. So again, I'm trying to reinforce to students that I'm never going to penalize them for their political views, but I can't be totally balanced, totally like I don't have any side in this. And, when you're dealing with some of what's going on in this country, and that's tough, because previously I think I was much better at saying, won't know where I stand politically on this or that issue. But given all that's going on, it's hard to just be directly in the middle. I don't know if my fellow panelists have had that problem as well.
But I think I would agree, and it would go back. I actually think it connects to what I said before about we're always navigating this tension of things are complex and nuanced, and we can have views on both sides, but some things are actually also just objectively wrong, right? So the same as I said about, terrorism, by the way, and I have no problem saying as a student, I think it applies to one of the things, something you're saying, and also explaining. So there may be some action of the president now that are actually horrific, and it's okay to say that the action itself, it doesn't mean that everyone who is Republican. And I think it's important. This is part of the message that we're giving the students, right? This is part of the message that I tell them when I come up and say, yes, I'm Israeli, and I wear my Star of David because it's my, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything that the government does. I'm a person, I'm not a government, right? And I think it's something that we need to, it's part of our responsibility to say this explicitly to the students rather than hide behind this and be very harsh about it. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if and then there's this. So I just think it gets back to this. I want to double down on this idea of the moral part and where that comes up. And there's this idea in Peter Lipton, who was writing, he has this thing called Inference to the Best Explanation, and it's kind of a spin-off of Charles Peirce's The Doctrine of Long History, but he has these ideas of lovely and likely. And so it likely is just verisimilitude, it's like closest to the truth, and lovely is how we put meaning on the stories that we tell to bring together these different facts. And we're always in this world of lovely, and humans have this huge attractiveness to stories and storytelling that we want to use to put together the facts. And if there's a moral backing to that, it becomes really strong. And so I just wonder how just recognizing that, I think, is really helpful to get students to engage with it in certain ways, like just recognizing the fact that your mind wants a clear and clean story. And then I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it sounds like a good approach. So what about the other one? The other two? How would you get this started? Like, or how did you start in your classrooms to bring heterodox tools and values in there? Was there ever a time when you didn't, or what do you think?
Yeah, so as I said, there were like glimpses of this in all of my ethics class because I was using Johnson Haidt materials like for years and so forth. But I think the main one was the Challenger conversation, and this is thanks to Rodri and the Ed Snyder Center. So sometimes I think you do need a center or an ally that would actually help you push this forward. Like, I don't think I would not have come by myself as an individual faculty with this class and even think about proposing it. But I think Rodri and Jacqueline are people, they're wonderful people there, said like this has actually become part of our mission as well. And we want as a center to promote this, and they have their tools. They're also the political university tools to talk with our dean, with the president, and promote it. And then I have the backbone of this to actually run this, right? On when we started, Jacqueline and I and others, and Raj, we call it fact-based open discourse, and Brent actually as well, inquiry. And we try to do events not just in my classes, but just to the whole university. And we did an event on social media and extremism last fall. We did an event on negotiations in the Middle East, which again was very charged. And I also broke I was the moderator of my negotiation kind of insights, and tried to apply things that have gone wrong there. And we brought a Palestinian, Egyptian, and an Israeli speakers. There was a lot of, so our president got like 1,000 emails trying to cancel this event. But the center and our dean said we're not canceling it. People can come and protest outside if they want. And we actually had that person from a student from the Social Justice for Palestine who actually sat in the audience and respectfully asked the question, and actually went to the speaker after and said, I'm sorry on behalf of others that sometimes we harass, a person like you, because she's actually a Muslim wearing a hijab that she's speaking out against Hamas. So she's been prosecuted for that. So I think having a center and having a backbone that helps you promote those things, it's very helpful.
Yeah, because I can imagine, if you're a couple years out of your PhD program, you just got your assistant professor, you don't have tenure yet. Are you going to start this? Yeah, maybe not, right? Because you want to get tenure, you don't want to rock the boat. It could be really scary, but principally, you really need to. If you're going to be a scientist, you have to start somewhere. And that can be hard if you don't have a center or you don't have the administration backing you up. It can be even harder, especially even if you're a non-tenure track faculty member. You can still be really hard because you can get fired for anything.
So I'll wonder, I think you could be subversive in small ways. What is it like? So I was thinking about this question. I was like, how do I teach this in the classroom? And I teach a case on Rent the Runway, the fashion, that's in they use Rent the Runway, where you rent a dress for a special event. And there's a lovely case. And what happens is the founders don't understand their own business as they're starting it. And you can show this with clarity. Then you challenge the students that, why didn't they know this? It's how you're trying to show that is kind of push the student into a place where they so clearly don't know in order to develop some intellectual humility for themselves. But it's completely safe because I'm not going to get in trouble for talking about Rent the Runway, in any way. And so, but it's still, the muscle is the same muscle. And so if there's a way to teach that muscle in less controversial spaces, and then with that you can move into the more highly charged spaces that my colleagues here so bravely endeavor to enter.
My brother is a professor.
It also strikes me how you have, feds or trains, especially in the Middle East. Look, I don't have any empirical data on this, but I suspect most of the professors who teach on the Middle East, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, traditionally have been very one-sided against Israel. They want not only Israel to change its government, to change its policies, they want Israel dead. And they have always felt comfortable expressing this in their classes and their syllabi. Now things have gone the other way, and maybe too much the other way, that any criticism of Israel, any criticism of Israeli policies is going to be looked upon as suspect. And the Trump administration is going to come after you. Johns Hopkins was one of 10 universities singled out as somehow being anti-Semitic. I have no idea where that came from. Yes, we've had some instances of anti-Semitism. I suspect no worse, maybe better than most other institutions. But nevertheless, once you have this label, I suspect professors and maybe students are now fearful of criticizing Israel, and you don't want that either. So I think we have to be careful pushing too much on one side and stick to the heterodox boundaries that we really believe people should be free to make controversial statements that go against the prevailing dogma, whether it comes from the university or from the government.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Is having those different viewpoints. And I get you with the trends. I mean, the trends in academia are funny things.
Well, many of my colleagues who teach on the Middle East have different views than I say. They're worried about speaking up. They're worried that if they have views critical of Israel, they will be punished by the university or by big nose or whatever. And one of the things I say to them is I appreciate their fears and their concerns, but also recognize that someone who is openly Zionist in maybe a more subtle way has as much or even more to fear. I would hate to be going up for tenure at my university at this time. I know that many people who make the decision on tenure, signed a letter right after October 7th, blaming Israel, even before the major retaliation in Gaza. So it works both ways. And I'm hoping we could reach a situation where people are free to advance their views without fear of retribution, either from the government or from the university or from their colleagues. But we ain't there yet.
I love this point, and I also see it as connecting to what I said in the beginning. This is why I also feel that, again, I added another stone in which I do have the responsibility to denounce extremism on either side, because I think we have those trends because we are going to one extreme and then we have this backlash from the other extreme, and I just don't think it's right. So again, it's not that I would not, and I'm not in favor of punishing people, but I think it is the responsibility of educators, university presidents to say, it may be fine to say this legally, but think about, do you want to say this? Do you want to say those horrific things that are very extremes on either side? And yes, we can say this. I don't think, so I guess again, it goes to me back to this tension of, yes, recognizing fierce and complex diversity of viewpoints, but let's stay more in the normal diversity and not go to the extreme of people are, like you're saying, either saying Israel should not exist, let's, kill the Jews, or the other way around, right? Neither is, and it's not going to advance us anywhere. And so,
I want to, this is such an interesting borderline that I've been struggling with this since I've been thinking about these issues. Where is that boundary of, a free speech absolutist will say anything goes, but we're a university. And a university that requires, in a way, if I'm going to engage in debate, and somebody else thinks that the way to win that debate is literally to make sure I can't speak, well, that's not going to work in our space. And that's going to itself undermine these ideas of free inquiry. So that what I hear Rellie saying, I don't want extremism, she's saying, to me, that's saying there are people who believe, such as Hamas, that the solution is to kill the other side. We can't have that. That ideology is not going to work in a university environment because it's counter to this idea of free inquiry. And I'm wondering, is there a boundary in some sense of what is conducive to the pursuit of truth at the university versus, as opposed to, this isn't a statement about what should be in the public square and free speech in generally, right? And it's just that's interesting to me. My sense is if you come into the Wells, you should be able to say whatever you want to say so long as you agree to only say and not prevent saying, right? But I don't know. It's interesting.
But I would just say, maybe I disagree with you a little rarely here, that in a lot of these areas, you need on the syllabus to present extremist views because that's the reality of what they're placing. I mean, in the Middle East, you've got to, I think, have views of people who support Hamas. You've got to have people who want expulsion of the Palestinians because this is the reality of the Middle East. If we simply have reasonable voices, people say, too, why are people killing each other there? Why aren't they all, singing Kumbaya together? I don't understand this. You've got to shepherd. This is also the reality of the Middle East. It's not just the Middle East. I was giving a class on white nationalism and is America headed through a civil war, and I wanted to assign, I think the book was called The Tyranny Diaries, have to deal with a blueprint for white nationalist, violence, and I couldn't get the book anywhere. I mean, I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism, assign selections from Mein Kampf, and I said, no, you can't do that. But
Did they do this? I want to clarify. Like, it's not that I don't think the idea should be discussed. So thank you. Your comment actually was really helpful in making sure that I'm clear. I'm talking about behavior, right? As opposed to a person with a particular behavior, as opposed to a particular idea showing up. So if you can get people to come on stage with diverse ideas, that's great. But when somebody's saying, I will legitimize this person or ideal, like that, I think is beyond the pale.
I get that, but I'm just saying it is very hard to get reading materials that express extreme views on all sides, and that's a shame.
Okay, so back to our questions. All right, if you could share one lesson, and one lesson only, from your teaching that wish every student carried with them beyond the classroom, what would it be? I think we're thinking about like lessons in the case of like on how to understand one another or how to debate well. Those kind of lessons. Heterodox lessons. How to be a heterodox.
Well, one lesson, I mean, the obvious one is you can have civil disagreement, but the other lesson that I hope they get from my course is that you've got to know your stuff. You can't just scream at everyone. I mean, if you're going to, again, talk about the Middle East, know the history. We can know the history as portrayed by different views, but damn it, know it. If you're going to say from the river to the sea, know what the hell, what river and what sea you're discussing. So much of the screaming and yelling goes on by people on all sides who don't know what the hell they're talking about. So do the work. Sadly, in most cases, that's not going to happen. But as educators, we could at least educate people with what the history and the background of these issues are. And I take pride in the fact that in my Middle East class, people came out of it with very different views from each other. And that's what I think our goal should be.
Great. Rel?
So first, 100% agree about like having the knowledge and don't just apply frameworks that are not cohesive because it's easy to do, without actually understanding the context and the conflict, for example, in the case of Israel, for example, and Gaza. But I would actually say, so in the end of the class last fall, we asked students what did they learn or what is one lesson that they take. So maybe I will just use that. Because one of the students said, what's the most thing that I'm taking with me is that from now on, when I'm scrolling my TikTok or Instagram, I'm not going to just automatically like. I'm actually going to check the source of this story on TikTok or Instagram, see whether it's correct, what has been said, and kind of learn about this. So for me and Pratiti, what was like, oh, okay, we did something. And again, it goes back to all this, even the conversation on and AI and thinking about this and what this all social media does to us and this extremism that sometimes comes with this or the polarization. So this was also, so it was a nice kind of reassurance about this class.
I've been in every single one of my classes. I've been doing this since COVID, and once I started doing it, I couldn't stop. I ask for gratitude from every student. So every student begins and says, I ask them, what are you thankful for today? Sometimes it's the weather, sometimes it's coffee, sometimes it's their 3-year-old, sometimes somebody came to visit, sometimes they were at a wedding, sometimes somebody shared food, and sometimes it's for Jesus Christ, right? It's everything. And what that does is it sets a tone for the class that everybody's a person. And so I guess that's the thing. It's like whenever you're talking to somebody else, never forget that you're talking to a human being. And that humanity, I think, is what we need. We forget that. And so that is the one, I think that's just at the core of heterodox values, actually, and to me. And so that's what I hope they learn.
No, I think that's wonderful. The fact that you're taking them and humanizing, because they're students. They're kind of anonymous in the classroom, so it makes them human is great. I'm always trying to get students just to take a minute before they say something. Like think about what you're going to say, and then make sure you know your stuff. But also think about your source. I mean, if you're just quoting some random junk off of TikTok, this is probably not the most accurate source. And so make sure you go back to the meat of the argument, and do you know what you're talking about? Where does this information come from? And then look at it, because I'm a political scientist, I'm an institutionalist. I'm like, what institution is this going to affect? Is this the Congress? Is it bureaucracy? Where does this come from? And how does that work? So I always just try and switch it around to talk about the government, so. Okay, thank you very much so far. So we're going to open it up to questions. Yeah. And if everything, are who happens? Good for it. What was your name?
Tom.
Tom?
I'd like to piggyback off of something each of the speakers said. Rellie, you were talking about the escalation to extremes, which is a central core of Rene Girard's mimetic theory, which also talks a lot about scapegoating. And mimetic theory, mimesis, imitations, Homo sapiens is the most imitative species. We learn by imitation, and imitation can actually go wrong. So according to Girard's theory, people might start about fighting about some object like the land in the Middle East. But as things escalate to extremes, they pretty much forget about what the fight is over, and they fight against each other, building up their hatred of each other until it reaches extremes. Brent was talking about morality. There's a view that evil is not an absence of morality, it's a perversion of morality. So in terms of Nazism taught that there could be no universal immorality, and there's a great book called The Nazi Conscience by the historian Claudia Kuntz, where she documents how the Nazis built up a moral case for Nazism, and the same thing happened in the other power morality of the last century, communism, where if you read, say, Trotsky's Our Morals and Theirs, anything is justified if it helps to bring about a society where everyone is equal. And what people use self-deception to convince themselves that their morality is infallible, and so I think self-deception is very central to all of this here.
So is that your question?
I'm just piggybacking on something each of the people said.
Okay. So you're talking about like people repeat things that they've heard before, whether it's evil, whether it's moral, and that can cause extremes. Is that where you're going?
The fundamental self-deceptive mechanism upon which theoretically all the other ones are based is called splitting. And typically somebody with a narcissistic or a borderline personality disorder, they're not able to form integrated images of other groups or other people. Have images of that, or they're all good or all bad. And as long as their attention is focused on the all good images, everything is fine. But when their attention is focused on the all bad images, then they go down the path towards hatred.
Okay. So do you all have comments?
Let's collect our question.
Okay, questions, okay. Yeah.
So this is a question. I heard a lot of the teaching with heterodox values and the answers focus on conversations, particularly across polarizing different viewpoints and stuff. And then you made a very astute comment, Brent, where you said they need to develop muscle memory. So as we're talking about heterodox values, could each of you comment on not so much on the secondary aspect of how do we have challenging conversations, but the primary aspect of how do heterodox values get into having them think the right way itself? So even as I'm thinking about looking at the 5 elements, great minds don't always think alike. How are you helping the students think appropriately before they can even engage in challenging their thinking?
I can start. So, and this is actually where I think, and we use this flipped classroom model, right? That they do a pre-work before they go into the classroom, and they may hear a podcast, they may read the article, and then and there will be different pieces that they have to read, and for each one of them, what we make them do before they come to class, and then we can actually read it in advance, is to think about, did it resonate, did it not, why did it resonate, why did it not? We also talk, by the way, in the beginning of the whole class about ad hominem arguments, ad populus, and you'll be surprised that they actually do not know what it is. So we ask, what is ad hominem argument or fallacy? They don't know, right? So we need to encourage them to think about the argument itself. Don't think about the person, if you like them or not. The argument itself, did it resonate? No, why, right? And they have to engage in this before the classroom. And as we were all talking about, sometimes they will not share it in the classroom. At least, though, they do it on Canvas, so we can see it. And sometimes, and I did it with the EMBA last Friday, I would share without saying who it is, because if they don't want to come out and say it in classroom, I will not force them. But I would share what they wrote. And I said, one student here, if they want to identify, they can, wrote this, really interesting, right? And then it helps them think. And one thing that we added to the classroom this fall is that we make them kind of do a diary, a journal. So every class, in the first 5 weeks or so, they have to think what in the theme of this class actually challenged one assumption that they had about themselves. And write it down. We actually, and the TA just make sure that they do it. We don't even read it. It's for themselves. It's a kind of a diary. And after 5 weeks, this changes to what did it change assumption that they had about other people in the classroom, because now it's more the debate stage that we have in the classroom. And this is all, and they have to add every week. So in the end of the class, they have kind of a diary to look back to and think like, I was in this journey in which I was thinking, but then I thought, once I heard about Lukianov and height safetyism, now I actually think differently. And I will see it in the responses on Canvas, and we also, I hope we will see it. They see for themselves with this diary that they create.
I think my use of flipping them in debates was very helpful in 2 ways. One, the obvious one, is that it forced them to put themselves in the shoes of people who they disagree with very strongly. But the other is they could mount a spirited, effective debate knowing that people aren't going to give them a hard time for it because they know that's not the position that they believe in. So one of the debates was, Israel was born in sin and does not have the right to exist. Well, you forcefully, you make the case, my gosh, there were mostly Palestinians in the area, 700,000 Palestinians were expelled and so forth. And they go on, and some students might be, I'm kind of angry at this person, but wait a minute, they believe the opposite, and they're simply having to voice these views. And I think that gave them a license to say things that they otherwise might have been uncomfortable in saying. So, at least in this class, I found it to be an effective tool.
So my answer is completely different, just because I live in a different world. So one of the things that happens in the entrepreneurs is they are constantly challenged by reality. They have to go sell something and it's real. And because it's real, they have to update, otherwise they will fail. Because the criteria for success is not being right, it's selling and persuasion and getting people to buy your product. And what's neat about that is by the end of 14 weeks, I can have my students look back and create a reflection piece or a diary, and part of that reflection is go through your 14-week journey and explain all the places where you were wrong and had to change what you were doing. And so it kind of instills this muscle of intellectual humility, which frankly, and now I'm going to put in this weird plug as I'm thinking about it, is like the magic part about teaching in a business school, which I was really conflicted about for like the first 10 years. It's like, what am I doing here? And you know, I believe in truth and I'm a social scientist and here I'm teaching in a business school. What's going on? But what you learn is that it's such an important part of our society, and learning to work through disagreement is such an important tool for career success. It kind of changes and it allows you to persuade people to engage in this, even if it's not something that they're doing ideologically because they're seeking truth. They're on a vocational journey in a way. And but then what we end up doing is seeding our society with lots of people who think in a heterodox way. And that's actually really healthy over time in a little subversive world with 30 people in the room. And so I just wonder if the point is sometimes diving into the deep end is what we want to do first, but building the muscle in safer, I hate to use that word, in spaces that are less emotionally and neurally charged, is that may set people up to do this better. And I just wonder to what extent is that true?
And I'll add in too, because I teach mostly undergraduates, having them understand that issues are not so black and white. You know, I mean, you're like 18, 20, and everything's a disaster to them, right? So having them understand that there's many more complexities to the issue than they ever even dreamed of. I mean, there's government, there's regulations, there's bureaucracy, there's all kinds of different stuff. And having them see that just opens a whole new world for them to see other problems in the same light. Like, maybe it's just not so black and white as I originally thought, and maybe I need to look deeper. And I think once they start that muscle memory of doing that, that's a great lesson to take away. Okay. Other questions?
Yes, George Opper from Hopkins. Thank you for the discussion. Just on the previous question, I think one thing that we can and should do as instructors is simply to model for them generous reading. You know, if we have set texts on a diversity which coming from a diversity of perspectives, I always tell our students that before we even start to offer a take or criticize them, let's try and fully inhabit the perspective of this text, right? So let's really try and inhabit the perspective that we shouldn't have laws against hate speech by reading this and discussing it, and then on 2 days from now we'll look at the other side, right? In listening to the discussion, I'm always putting myself in the position of the student who doesn't yet have a view, right? Who is there, you know, in the spirit that Tomasi talked about earlier, to acquire knowledge and to search for truth. I'm worried that setting people up to take a position and take a side in a debate too early is in conflict with that. It might be in conflict with that goal. I guess my real question is, how does teaching with heterodox values differ from at least for me would be ordinary teaching?
Ordinary teaching for who?
Me.
Well, and it's up to the adult glasses.
But rather than either cares in what does teaching the heterodox values mean, if you're not necessarily going to immediately engage that into art topics, you they tie conversations and it.
Yes.
Well, to me, I'm going to be repetitive. To me, that would mean teaching somebody arguments for the sake of heaven. I wouldn't use that language, perhaps in our classroom. Maybe I would, right? But the idea, and with that, I would hope a couple things. The first is that I really respect Stephen in this, in the sense that I would hope that nobody knows about political wars in my classroom. Like that would be kind of like one of the I don't want anybody to know how I vote. I don't want anybody to know what those underlying thoughts are, because my goal is to teach them how to think, not what to think. But that includes, like, there's triggers for seeing this in other syllabi where you know that's not true. So, for example, if I see a land acknowledgement on a syllabus, I know what the ideological, right? And so then I wonder if to go full, like, beyond us and what we can do is, like, should we be demanding this in campus of our colleagues, right? And in what sense diverse scholarship activism fit in this? Because that seems completely counter to heterodox values to me, right? And I just want to encounter to the purpose of the university itself. And so I just wonder if and how we should be working within campus to try to push back against that. I mean, is that our role? I don't know.
So I'd add to that also, so I'm also an administrator, and I think a lot of the classroom, faculty tend to be fairly open, sort of, in their classroom. I think you have to take a step back to the actual classes and the scheduling of classes and the titles of classes. That if your whole department is about women and gender studies, and it's only looking at women and LGBTQ issues, then you're not being as diverse as you could be. Where are the studies on men? Where's the studies on the other side of that? So I think you have to back it up to the actual courses that you offer in your departments or at the university, not just in classroom.